So let's talk about the Czech defense. I think that this is a largely neglected opening because no one really plays this way since there are like so many better defenses for black against e4. But it is important to know because the dynamics get really wild, and it's very similar to the Pirc where black, just gives up the center, but eventually hopes to play around it or and eventually challenge the center in a certain way. So yeah, anyways, I think that this will be useful if you play e4 or even d4 because if you play d4, okay, first off, like this is the main position we're going to be looking at. d4, knight f6, knight c3, and then c6. So this move c6 is called the Czech defense. Now, this may be useful also for d4 players because against d6, one problem of playing the move c4 is that black may have the move e5 here. And some people may not like to play this position as white because black seems to have like quite a solid score with this move. And the idea is that if you exchange it to this endgame, this is no problem at all for black because not having the move the c-pawn forward means that you can put the pawn at c6, bring the king to c7, and this is a very solid position. Black even scores better than white by a big margin here. So instead of that, if white plays a move knight f3, for example, then the lines could get complicated after e4. And yeah, black also seems to score quite good in these lines. So if you want to avoid that as a d4 player, then you can of course enter e4. But if you don't play e4 and you don't know how to deal with the Philidor and the Pirc and the Czech defense, then it doesn't make sense to play this way, right? So that's why basically this video can also be useful for d4 players if you want to face the first move d6. You can just play, get the full pawn center and just transpose into e4 openings. So after knight f6, knight c3 in this position, I want to make a video also on the Pirc, starting with g6, where I will recommend the move bishop e3. And then after bishop g7, queen d2. So this is later what's going to be called the 150 attack. And we're going to go into that in the next video. But first I want to cover this sideline, the move c6, which is called the Czech defense. And it's a very solid opening at first glance because, it's a very non-committal move. You don't control the center this way, but at the same time, you have ideas of the move queen a5 here to first off trying to pin the knight, threatening knight takes e4, and also maybe at some point playing the move e5. This is a very common setup. And the main refutation against the Czech defense is the move f4, which we will go into. But I also want to mention that knight f3 is a perfectly reasonable option just to transpose into the normal Pirc. Let's say g6. Even if you enter like a position, let's say with the classical bishop e2 and then castles, this position is known to be like slightly better for white because white has the full center and black doesn't really, isn't really able to challenge the center so effectively, and white has quite a bit of space. So yeah, these positions are completely fine, and it can cut down on a lot of work if you play the move knight f3 here. But if you play f4, then it's really like, I think that you have a very nice advantage, and it's not difficult to remember how the lines go. It's just that you need to know the dynamics of it, and when certain moves are played, how should you respond to them? Okay. So this move, first off, f4 has the downside of weakening this long diagonal, but as we will see, black is not actually able to challenge us in the center that way. So here, their most critical move is queen a5, trying to pin the knight on c3, threatening the move knight takes e4. So here, there are a couple of moves. First off, e5. This is the most aggressive option, but in general, I don't like pushing the pawn to f4 and pawn to e5 so early when white hasn't, fully developed. But this was recommended by Wesley So in his chessable course on 1e4. So yeah, I'm not a fan of this, but it is quite playable. Instead, this move bishop d3 is quite solid and very strong, just defending the pawn e4 and preparing to develop knight f3, castles, and at some point bishop e3, right? So here, black can play the move e5. This is the main move, and at some point they want to maybe develop the bishop out to this way. But first, maybe they want to challenge the center. Let's say after knight f3, and then now bishop g4. This would make a lot of sense, right? But what happens if black plays the move bishop g4 now? Now, this is rare, but it's possible first off to just transpose with knight f3, entering the normal Pirc, But an even stronger move is this nice move queen d2, which is very nice because it highlights the fact that this bishop on g4 is actually quite vulnerable, and it also unpins the knight on c3. So at some point, moving the knight away is possible. Here, black can play the move e5, just trying to challenge the center, but now we can simply play the move d5, which is not a common move in the Pirc, but the big point is that this bishop is quite vulnerable. So after d5 and f5, white already has a big advantage here because h3, g4 is coming. And yeah, it's really difficult to stop this, if not impossible. So yeah, white's already much better there. So black can't play e5 immediately. If they play, you know, like just a non-committal move like knight a6, maybe, you know, preparing knight b4 or something, then we see that because we haven't played the knight to f3, we can just play h3, kicking the bishop back to d7, let's say, and then knight f3. And only white can be better here because they have the big center. And, you know, we didn't even have to exchange this knight, which is quite nice, you know, holding white center together for this bishop. So yeah, this is just an overwhelming advantage. Let's say knight b4 and castles. So, yeah, this sort of position is really nice, even though if, you know, black tries to win the bishop here, white has a very nice space advantage and a pawn center here. So this is a big advantage. Yeah, for example, like g4 as well as e5 ideas are in the air, and black king is still stuck in the center. So that's the idea of bishop g4. If they play e5 here, first off, it's important to understand that we don't really want to take on e5, because the queen is here, and like it's very nice to sort of protect the e5 pawn. And this also opens up the bishop on this diagonal, so at some point maybe the bishop can go on c5, or even later it can, you know, occupy the b4 square. And so this is not really what we want to play. Let's have your d5, knight f3, bishop g4 is nice for black, and after, let's say if we take the pawn on e5, black just simply retreats and has a lot of counterplay targeting this e5 pawn. Let's say bishop f4, this is just a sample line. g5 is even like very strong. And then bishop comes back to g3, which is best, and then now bishop a3 leads to a very wild position, which I really don't want to recommend. And I think that's, I mean, the computer still says that white has an advantage here, but I really don't want to recommend something this crazy, yeah, and unclear. So instead, the better move is just to play the move knight f3, just defending the center. And black here has a fundamental decision of where do they want to put the pieces, and if they want to exchange in the center. Now let's look at what happens if they exchange in the center. So the downside of our move f4 is obviously that it weakens this diagonal. But if black ever takes swing and tries to take advantage of the diagonal, they're not able to do so because black has played d6 and c6. So they can't put an c6 to pressure the center, and they can't develop this bishop out to c5, where it would be nice to control the diagonal, right? So essentially what is better after this? We'll just play knight takes d4. If black tries to target the knight with queen b6 and the diagonal, simple, we just play bishop e2 and castle. And we have a nice advantage in the center, also by taking the pawn on, pawn on d4. Here, it also frees up this f5 square. So white can, maybe in the future play castles, king h1, maybe even advance to g4, g5, and yeah, it's a very nice position. Instead, black can go for a g6 setup and just trying to set up, the normal Pirc defense, but having taken on d4. But this doesn't really make sense because we get a big lead in development here. Let's say after castles, bishop g7, and now king h1. Very standard move, just getting out of the long diagonal. And after castles, we can immediately start the attack with f5. And the idea of f5 is not only to put some pressure on the g6 pawn, but also it cuts out this queen from being able to defend. Like, let's say if we play the move queen e1 and to h4, black can already try to go with queen h5, try to exchange the queens off. So instead, we play f5, and this is very strong. After, let's say, knight b7, now queen e1, bringing the queen into the attack, queen h4, followed by bishop h6, and yeah, this is a very, very dangerous position for black. So this is not recommended to exchange on d4. Black can play the move bishop knight b to d7, just a solid move, but this is quite awkward because the c8 bishop is not just bad, right? So after castles, black has a decision here, right? They should probably play the move bishop e7, which makes more sense than the move g6 here, but of course we should look at what happens to g6. Now this setup makes no sense because black has just played e5, right? So even if they put the bishop on g7, it's blocked by their own pawn. And so now I think that it makes a lot of sense to take on e5. And the point is, after d takes e5, because black has played g6, they have to put the bishop on g7 to, justify their play. They can't put the bishop on c5 anymore because then they would just abandon their dark squares. So that's why it makes sense to take on e5 now. And let's say after king h1, just getting away from the long diagonal, bishop g7, and now again the typical move queen e1, where we want to play queen h4 at some point, and we're only waiting for black to castle. And after they castle, then we can consider the move f5, so we can shut the queen down so it can't join the defense on h4. And black here has a decision. If they castle, then f5 now, and as mentioned as mentioned before, queen h4, bishop h6, knight g5, the attack is just overwhelming here. Strategically, black is just lost. So after queen e1, black can try to, say that, okay, I'm just going to play queen c7. I'm just going to wait. I'm not going to castle because I know you're going to hit me with f5. But now, because the queen is on c7, it's supporting the center, and black is trying to get some counterplay with b5. So, remember, once black plays queen c7, there is the possibility of playing b5 without the e5 pawn hanging. So now we'll play a4, preventing any queenside counterplay. And let's say after castles, and now we play queen h4, preventing preparing f5, bishop h6, and black is not surviving this in practice. So yeah, so that's the move g6, right? Essentially, we just take on e5, and we should have a good position because black has committed themselves to g6. Instead, if they play bishop e7, which is the only move that makes sense, really, because they need to just castle and, not get destroyed in the center, we play bishop e3 now. And this may seem like it's vulnerable to the move knight g4, but after knight g4, the bishop has a good square in d2 to retreat to. So at some point, then this knight will be kicked away with h3. If black plays a move like queen b6, because we are potentially threatening some knight d5 advances, and the winning the bishop would be quite nice for us. Queen to b6 is possible to try to take advantage of the long diagonal, but now again, we just play king h1. And you cannot be this greedy. Queen b2 is just bad. Rook b1, rook b3, and the queen is running out of squares, right? Even after queen a5, we have this very strong move, knight g5. And the knight on g4 is hanging, the king is still stuck in the center, so we're going to be able to open up the position. One sample line is this: if the knight retreats, which the computer already recommends giving up a piece, but this one is bad after we open up the f-file. F takes e5, d takes e5, and then now we can unleash a discovered attack with knight d5. And then after the queen goes back to d8, because it's hanging, then now we can play knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now bishop c4, even sacrificing the knight here because f7 is weak. After bishop takes g5 and queen h5, this is game over. Yeah, everything is just weak and loose here in black's position. So instead of grabbing the pawn with queen takes b2, best is just to take on d4, but now we have the nice move knight e4, just kicking away the queen. It can't go anywhere to defend this d4 pawn, and then after this, white is a lot better because, black has exchanged in the center, but white has a big space advantage. This knight in g4 is hanging, and white can play queen e1 to g3 next, right? And this is just a big advantage for white. So yeah, that's essentially the move queen b6. If they go queen c7 back, then now first up we can play h3, kicking the knight away. And now because black has dropped the queen back to c7 and they're supporting the center, they want to play b5 next, right? So what do we play? Of course, we play a4. And that's the important dynamic to understand. Whenever black plays queen c7, just trying to defend their pawn on e5 again, then we play a4, trying to prevent their counterplay. And essentially that's the idea of the Czech defense for white. It's just, prevent any of your opponent's counterplay and you should be better. Okay, so that's knight g4. If black decides to castle on the sort of position, then after king h1, we free up the g1 square for our bishop, and yeah, and simply white is just better here. I mean, I'll put some sample lines in the study below, but essentially, yeah, there's not much to be said about the positions, just like white has a big center and a big space advantage. So yeah, that's essentially this move knight bd7. The most serious move is just the move bishop g4, and the last one we're going to cover. This makes sense because they're trying to pin the knight and put pressure on our center, right? But essentially, if white is able to win the bishop for the knight, then we would have a long-term advantage, right? And if black doesn't give away the bishop and we're able to maintain our center, then we've basically just won the battle of the opening because black is unable to put sufficient pressure on our center. So here we play bishop e3, defending the d4 pawn, and after knight bd7, we play castles. And then after, let's say, bishop e7, trying to prepare castling next, we play h3. And now, taking on f3 would just help the queen develop. Ideas of playing like g4, trying to attack, here are very good. And yeah, black is much worse in this sort of position. Instead, bishop h5 is possible, but now we play g4. And of course, like black most likely won't play this way because this is so provocative, but this is one of the possible lines that has been seen in practice. And here, of course, they don't want to retreat and run into f5, so they have to take on f4, hitting our bishop first, so we recapture, and then after bishop g6, we can play this strong move knight h4. And despite, white has a center, they've weakened their king side a bit, I mean, quite significantly, but black can't take advantage of it, and white can potentially, just win the bishop, or even head to f5 at some point. And yeah, this extra space is worth a lot more than the fact that we've weakened our king somewhat. And after, let's say, castles, we can now drop the bishop back to e3, just defending the d4 pawn. And we have ideas even of like either winning the bishop pair or playing g5 and activating our queen on g4. And this is a very strong initiative for white. So that essentially covers the Czech defense. It's quite short on the theory, but it's important to understand the dynamics of, when you play a4, if you play one wrong move, essentially black can equalize a lot of the time. So you need to understand the different thematic ideas in each position, and when to play those moves, like when to play a4, when to play f4, when to play, bishop e3, when to play bishop d3, things like that. But yeah, this should cover most of what you should know. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see a video on the Pirc or any other opening, then just let me know. I'll try to work on it. But yeah, I'm just trying to finish up coverage of 1e4, and first off covering all the sidelines, and then we'll go into the main lines with e4, e5. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.